Hello. In this video, we're going to talk about the case study analysis paper and how to write it. So in this video, I'll begin by talking about my late paper policy, just to remind us all. Then I'm going to go through the case studies that you can use for this assignment, and there's quite a few of them. Then I'm going to talk about things that are unique about a philosophy paper. I'm going to walk through the 7 steps that you'll go through to complete the case study analysis paper. Then I'm going to present a few tips for writing your paper. All right, I'll start with my late paper policy. So this was in the video that was in the introduction to the class, but in any case, you'll lose 5% per day that your paper is late, up to 25%. So after 5 days late, you stop losing points. Now, the reason that I do this is so that there's always a reason to turn your paper in, even if it's really, really late. And you'll notice, I'm sure, that this is different from the weekly assignments. So the weekly assignments, after the due date has passed, after that following Monday, you can't turn them in anymore. But with the papers, you can turn them in at any point. But if you turn them in really late, you lose 25%. And part of the reason I do this is so that I can still give an honest grade, but that there's always a reason to submit the paper. So I've gone through a couple of different sort of formats, and this is the one that I've come up with that works the best. So in any case, 5% per day, up to 25%. But in any case, I think that the best advice I can give is, look, just turn your paper in on time. It's not worth the 2 extra days and the 10 extra percent. Just turn in what you got on time, and in almost every case, you'll come out better. So in any case, here we go. So what case studies can you choose from for this assignment? So there's quite a few, and you can choose any case study from chapters 1, 2, or 4. So just sort of an overview of what those include. The case studies included in chapter 1 are breastfeeding in public on pages 19 and 20, the real price of coffee on pages 20 and 21, Jurassic Kitty, Should I Clone My Cat on pages 22 and 23, and sex selection on pages 23 or 24. Now, we'll remember from class that we worked through best breastfeeding in public as one of our case studies. You're certainly welcome to do this one or any of the others if any of those speak to you more. In chapter 2, arranged marriage on page 40, female genital mutilation on pages 40 and 41, religious exception and the death of Matthew Swan on pages 42 and 43, and women in the Middle East on pages 43 and 44. And then in chapter 3, there are 3 case studies. So there's Mr. Research on pages 81 and 82, Who's Not Coming to Dinner on pages 82 and 83, and then the one that we looked at class, Who's Responsible for Obesity on page 84. So again, you can choose any of these, even one of the even one of the case studies that we looked at in class. That's totally fine. Or if one of the ones that we didn't look at in class speak to you more, by all means, choose that. Okay. Now, there are a few things that are unique about philosophy papers that make them a little bit different than papers in some of our other classes. So, a philosophy paper is neither a research paper, nor is it an exercise in literary self-expression. All right? Instead, a philosophy paper is a reasoned defense of a thesis. Now, notice that a reasoned defense of a thesis isn't the same thing as simply giving your opinion. So sometimes I think people, after taking a philosophy class, they say like, it's just all about my opinions. No, philosophy class and philosophy papers are about reasoned defenses of theses, okay? This is a different thing than simply giving your opinion. Now, in philosophy papers, clarity is valued over style. So what I mean by this is that it's very important to be clear, even if sometimes that means being a little bit redundant. It's okay to be a little bit redundant if being a little bit redundant is the best way to be clear. It's best to use the first person I while writing, and we're going to get a glimpse into what I'm talking about when I talk about the introduction and conclusion here. But this is a little bit different than most of the papers and most of our classes. In most of our classes, I think people are encouraged to maybe write in the third person, but in philosophy papers, it is best to write in the first person because it's your reasoned defense of your thesis. So this can take a little bit of practice, but I think it's fairly straightforward. And once you get the hang of it, and this paper will follow a very precise format. So if when you read that a philosophy paper is a reasoned defense of a thesis, it kind of stresses you out because you're not sure what thesis you're going to defend, that will be very straightforward. So don't worry about that. All right. And the point of these papers is to closely investigate an ethical case study in a systematic way. All right. Now, our papers have 7 parts. So the first part is a philosophy paper introduction. And then the next 5 parts you're going to notice from our case study analysis assignments. The second part is to summarize the main problem and its setting. The third part is to list possible ways of responding to the problem. The fourth part is to identify the moral principles and theories that are most directly applied to the case. The fifth part involves identifying and justifying the run response that you think is morally best. The sixth part is explaining why the other possible responses are not as acceptable. And then finally, a philosophy paper conclusion. Now, I'm going to spend most of this video talking about the introduction and the conclusion. Now, note that each part of this paper should be at least 1 paragraph, so your paper should be at least 7 paragraphs long, but it's okay to take more than 1 paragraph for some of the parts, all right? So if it takes more than 1 paragraph to complete what you have to say and with some of those parts, that's totally okay. And I intend for you to write the paper like a continuous essay. So I've broken it carefully into parts, and I'm doing that because I have a very precise sort of formula that I want you to follow for putting together this paper. But that being said, I intend for it to be written as a continuous essay. I don't really need you to label each of the parts as you move through them. Instead, imagine it as one continuous essay with at least 7 paragraphs and maybe more if you need a couple of paragraphs to complete a part. All right. Now we're going to move on to the introduction. All right. So introductions for philosophy papers are very boring. To begin, you write the thesis that you're going to defend. Then you explain in detail exactly how it is you're going to defend it. All right. Now, this could be a little bit weird, but I recommend that you write the introduction and the conclusion after you've finished the rest of the paper. So the 5 steps of the case study analysis, it can be pretty helpful to work through all of those independently and then write the introduction and conclusion at the end, because you'll need to know where it is you're going to write the introduction and the conclusion. And I think that this might be a little bit different than most other papers and other classes you write. So you probably will know, or you'll have at least maybe some idea of what the thesis is that you're going to try to defend, but exactly how you'll defend it is helpful to have worked through the rest of the steps before you write the introduction and conclusion. And I'm very serious about including the introduction and conclusion in exactly the way that I'm outlining in this video. And you'll lose points if you decide that you're going to freestyle your introduction or conclusion or write it in the way that you would write it for another class. So I have a very precise way that I want you to do this, and my preference is that you follow that process. All right. So here is an example of an introduction for a paper. So as I said, begin by writing the thesis that you're going to defend. So in this paper, I'm going to argue that breastfeeding in public is the morally right thing to do in every circumstance. All right. Then I want you to explain in detail exactly how you're going to defend it. So this is what I mean when I say that. So as you'll see, we're going to go through exactly the steps that will be laid out in the rest of the paper. So In this paper, I'm going to argue that breastfeeding in public is the morally right thing to do in every circumstance. To do this, first I'm going to summarize a case study involving breastfeeding. Then, this will help identify the problem I will be discussing. As we will see, the case study involves a young mother breastfeeding in public. Next, I'm going to list the different ways that it's possible to respond to this case study, identify 3 possible ways to respond. Then I'm going to identify the moral principle that most directly applies to this case, and use this principle to justify the response I think is morally right. Finally, in order to defend my response, I'm going to explain why the other 2 responses are not acceptable. Okay, so the thesis, and then explaining exactly how you're going to defend it. All right, now I want you to work through the 5 steps of the case study analysis, and we'll remember what these are. Summarize the main setting, the main problem in its setting. List possible ways of responding to the problem. Identify moral principles and theories that most directly apply to the case. Identify and justify the one response that you think is morally best. And finally, explain why the other possible responses are not as acceptable. And I'm going to include the video where I go through these in case you need a refresher. All right. So then after you've gone through the 5 steps as we've laid out, then you'll move on to your conclusion. All right. So conclusions for philosophy papers are as boring as introductions. I want you to begin by identifying the thesis that you defended, and then explain exactly what you just did in the paper to defend it. Then, I want you to conclude with 3 or 4 sentences expanding on what you learned from working through this case study analysis carefully. Now, I have the asterisk there because although all the rest of these steps that I've presented in the introduction and the conclusion for philosophy papers are fairly standard for most professional philosophy papers, this last piece about expanding on what you learned from the case study is something unique to this assignment, and I think it's just helpful because I do intend for you to gain something from this, to after you've completed it, reflect on what exactly that is. All right, so here's an idea of what I have in mind. So by identifying the thesis that you defend and explain what you did to defend it. In this paper, I argued that breastfeeding in public is the morally right thing to do in every circumstance. To do this, I first presented a case study that involved a young mother breastfeeding in her school cafeteria. Presenting this case study helped me clearly identify the problem of if it is okay to breastfeed in public, and if so, under what conditions it's okay. I was able to identify 3 possible responses to this problem. After defending the principle that feeding babies is more important than anything else, I was able to argue that breastfeeding in public is the morally right thing to do in every circumstance. To defend this view, I explained why the other possible responses were not acceptable. All right, then the next piece is to expand on what you learned from this case study analysis. And this is just sort of an overview of what one might say. From considering this case study, I learned that it can be difficult to defend a really radical view. I ended up arguing that breastfeeding in public is the morally right thing to do in every circumstance. However, to do this successfully, I had to carefully explain why it was okay to breastfeed even in places where this may not seem reasonable to some people. This was harder than I thought it was going to be, and it made me appreciate why people sometimes hold a more moderate view. All right. So now, some tips. So, you shouldn't need to cite anything in this paper. There's no need to cite the pages from the book should you bring those in. But if you do cite something, I encourage you to use MLA citation. And to be clear, I will not grade you on your citation style. All I care about is that if you cite something, I'm able to figure out what it is that you're citing so that I can check up on it if I need to. All right. In addition, this is a chance to carefully work through a challenging moral situation to figure out what you believe and why you believe it. And I think to have this opportunity to carefully think about the other side of the view. This isn't really an opportunity that we have often in our lives. So I realized that encouraging students to appreciate assignments in their college classes is something that only an instructor would do. But here I am. So, I'm clearing out most of the assignments for this week, and I encourage you to just really get into this assignment and try to get the most out of it that you can. I think it's helpful to spend some time brainstorming before you begin so that you know exactly how you're going to work through each of the steps. Now, brainstorming works different for different people. Some people like to carefully outline things. Some people like to just sort of dive in and start working. But in any case, I think it can be helpful to kind of think through things before you get in the middle of your paper. And as I said earlier, I think it can be very helpful to write the introduction and the conclusion to the paper last. Feel free to be obnoxious or combative or contrarian or none of these things if you would like. I certainly leave it up to students to choose whatever voice it is that they prefer. What matters is that you carefully and clearly work through each step in the analysis process. The tone does not matter so much to me. Extra stuff to fill space is not good. I don't want this. I've identified that there need to be 7 parts, each of which is a paragraph. I've explained carefully how to write the first and the last paragraph. And in addition, in my other video, I laid out exactly how to go through each of the steps. I don't need extra stuff to fill space. Other than the conditions that I've outlined, I do not care how long the paper is. In my experience, it usually takes about 2 or 3 pages or so to do a good job, usually about 2.5 or 3. And sometimes if people are particularly verbose, it may take them 5. That's totally okay. Whatever it takes, use that much, but don't feel like there's some invisible mark that you have to get to. Don't do that. Extra stuff to fill space is not good. Now, something else I offer is that you can feel free to include an appendix where you can write anything extra that you would like that won't fit in the paper, but that you still want to say. So this is sort of a weird thing that I include at the end here because sometimes, I've laid out a very precise format that I want you to follow. And sometimes students, after they've gone through this, they still have a bunch of stuff that they want to say and they want me to read, but it doesn't fit in the paper. And if you find yourself in that situation, just at the end of your paper, put Appendix 1 and then say anything else that you just really need to say, okay? Now look, most students will not do this, and that's totally okay. This is not required at all. Certainly do not take it that way. This is just if there's more that you want to say that doesn't fit in the paper, this is your opportunity to do that. And I will read it, and you won't be graded on it. I'll read at least the first few pages. If you give me 15 extra pages, I will not read all of that, but I'll read the first couple of extra pages that you include if you are moved to. And if you're not moved to, by all means, do not worry about it. All right. So notice that you don't have to personally agree with any of the things that you argue in this paper. And in fact, you can often learn more about writing a paper arguing in favor of a view that you don't hold. It can be very valuable to write a paper arguing in favor of the opposite of the view that you hold, just as an exercise. The point of this paper is to carefully work through the process of analyzing a case study. And your personal views can be separate from all of this. So that's something that I think is pretty interesting and valuable about philosophy papers. They can certainly be about what it is that you believe, and this is an excellent opportunity to look closer into that. But one way you can do that is by arguing for things that you don't believe. All right. And finally, I've said this in the introductory material to this class, but my views don't matter, so do not take them into account. All right, so let me know if there are any questions, and I will be happy to answer them, and I look forward to reading all